Infinity is not an unmoving eternity. It's not an unchanging eternity, right? Infinity desired intimacy, or infinity desired and desires finitude. Now, doesn't that sound remarkably like a story? In other words, a story has desire, right? A story has a plot line, a story has freedom, a story desires more value, right? A story has both interiors and exteriors. There's causal connection between the events in a story. In other words, the inception of reality itself is part of the divine story. And it's God, Goddess herself is not merely a thing. She's the logos, the word. She's a story. God not only loves stories, God is a story. You know, in the dream that I shared last week, actually what happened in the dream was that there were these 4 questions that were in play. And my friend Lena was thinking about 3 of those 4 questions. The 4th one we haven't clarified. And I responded in the dream to the people asking, right? And then we clarified it. And then I shared it with Zach and Keiki, and we clarified it even farther. But what we were remembering from that dream was just a very simple truth, which is in the waking world, I don't really have words to describe to myself, right, let alone to anyone else, the unbearable privilege. I mean, it's unbearable of actually being healthy, or functional, you're healthy enough to function, right? Having energy, caring, right? To care is not so easy to care, right? To actually care for the larger whole, right? To feel both the agony and the ecstasy of the world, to see the meta crisis clearly, to see a way through, which is real, which is to actually tell a new story of value, to actually evolve the source code of consciousness in culture. And the source code itself is, at its very core, the story we tell about who we are, where we live, and what we ought to do. Now, that story is the very essence of the source code. So to evolve the story is to evolve the source code, and only the evolution of a story, and a particular kind of story, a new story of value, has the capacity to respond to the meta crisis, right? And to actually, I wouldn't even say, Lena, avert suffering. I'm going to use a new word, alleviate suffering, right? To alleviate suffering, right? The suffering, right, is unimaginable, both in the present and the potential suffering of the future, or the stillborn nature of the future, right? The cries of the unborn, the trillions of unborn that turn to us. And actually living in the new story of value has the ability to actually be a bottom-up, self-organizing solution that literally reconfigures the nature of coherence. Does everyone get that sentence? It's a crazy big sentence. And the way coherence happens, right, is coherence responds to a story. So I'm going to talk about this more today when we talk about stories. But to have, the only point I want to make now is to have the privilege to do this is unimaginable, right? It's unimaginable. And I don't know if you're not, and if I'm not, like, kind of fainting in gratitude right now that we were born at this time, that each of us are born in this place, that we're not, each of us, in the middle of a pitched battle, right, on a street in the Ukraine at this moment, which I'm profoundly worried about. And I'm profoundly worried about, particular voices in the right wing of American politics and people like Bobby Kennedy, right, who I think are saying things that are fundamentally wrong about the Ukraine. I think we have to oppose Putin. I think any notion that Putin was or is operates in good faith is tragic, and that's a war that we need to fight, and we need to win, and we need to support the Ukraine in all of its pathology, because the Ukraine is far from perfect, and there's a million issues. Nonetheless, we need to be there, right, in some big and profound way. But that we're not fighting the Ukraine, my friends, right? We're supporting it. We wrote a book on it. We talked about it. But we're in our homes. We're not in Rafah in Israel. We're not in other parts of Gaza, right? We're not in the Sudan, right? And the list goes on. I can go through the list. We're not in Angola, right? Where basically you have tens and tens of thousands of people who are amputees because there are 100,000 uncleared mines in Angola. Right? And there's uncleared mines in the world. Will probably take us a few centuries to clear the mines in the world. And people are regularly, every 19 minutes or so, someone gets a limb blown off in the world because we haven't actually turned our attention to clearing the mines that could easily be cleared. I'm not even going there, right? There's so much I could say, but 99% of us on this call, we are not there. Right? We are living lives of unbearable, unimaginable privilege. And so we have two jobs. One is to celebrate. I'm just to be like unimaginably celebratory. And Angus, there's lots of things I could have mentioned. I was just saying it in passing, right? But we have to be unbearably celebratory. We've got to be in mad gratitude, right? And we need to turn towards the meta crisis, right? And take radical responsibility upon ourselves. And again, this is, and I apologize for the next sentence. We got a huge Dharma today. And I'm so crazy happy to be with you every week. I'm like crazy happy. It brings me great joy, and it's a great privilege. And it's an insane responsibility. And what I've been trying to tenderly say to myself, and I say to everyone else, whoever's willing to listen and doesn't hang up the phone, is this is not a fucking hobby. Right? And apologize, Oriana. Let's delete one word from that sentence, and it's not hobby. Right? But this is not a hobby. Right? This has got to hurt. Right? I've got to approach this with a sacrificial fierceness and a sacrificial tenderness. In Hebrew, the word for sacrifice and the word for intimacy are the same. It's a three-letter root, korban, karov. To be intimate and to sacrifice are the same. Right? You cannot be intimate if you're not willing to sacrifice. And sacrifice might be something as simple but profound as I sacrifice, I bracket myself to hear you. And I give up being right. And that sacrifice allows us to be intimate. That's one level of sacrifice. To be intimate with another human being, that's essential. On the world stage, on the global stage, we have to also get over polarization and hear each other. But even more deeply or more immediately or more concretely is we have to act. And to act minimally means, right? It doesn't mean we have to go fight in the Ukraine, although some really good people have done that, and that could be a beautiful thing to do if it's appropriate. But it doesn't mean we have to go, right? But minimally it means that we actually feel the whole, we take responsibility for the whole, and we resource in every way we can with our time, with our funds, with our energy, with writing a review, right? With our participation in a great unique self-symphony that's trying to generate, right, a new story of value. We say, this is ours. This is not Marc's project, not in the slightest. This is ours. We are a unique self-symphony. We are going to do this together. We're going to do this together. We're committed to this. We're committed to this. Okay, ready? Blood on the ground. All the way. We're going to take this all the way home. Now I wanted to stay with me for a second. It's scary to hear anybody talk like that, right? Because we think that sacrificial fierceness and sacrificial tenderness, we think either that's limited for the one person I'm close to, if I have one person at all, which most people don't, even if they're living with someone. But if I have one person, which is gorgeous, I limit it to them, or, right, this notion of sacrifice, right, is a scary notion. right? That's what the old pre-modern religions wanted us to do, and we're not going to do that, right? Right. So of course, we don't want to hear that. So we need to address, right, our commitment to the whole, right? And I'm going to say one word to my friend Angus, right, who wants me to talk about Gaza again, right? I don't have any reluctance to talk about Gaza, my friend, right? I've talked about Gaza in 4 or 5 different One Mountains, right? And I do think you're right, Angus. I think that it, at some point in the relatively near future, we need to do an entirely new big conversation, right, on Israel. We haven't actually had a full direct conversation about it. So I think your point is fair, and I give you my word that I will do it. Right? I haven't done it yet for a number of reasons, but it hasn't been casual. Right? And I mean, actually, Angus, just between you and me, no one else is listening, okay? So just between us, a lot of the reason is I could just do it. I'm deeply in the issue and just talk about it, but I actually want to think it through very carefully, right? Because I think I want to just not just talk about it. I want to actually just kind of feel through it, think it through, and do kind of an, if I could, a kind of, full, kind of, they say in literature magisterial, but I don't mean magisterial in the sense of a complete, to talk about it completely from all the perspectives and not just handle a couple of issues. And to do that, I want to think about it more deeply. But so Angus, point received, brother, right? I agree. We do need another deep conversation on Israel, right? And it's important to happen. And I'm, just so everyone here knows, I'm deeply, deeply connected. One of my dear friends, right, is an Arab who, a wonderful Palestinian Arab who lives in Gaza, right, and who's, deeply connected to Gaza. I'm much more connected than I think anyone on this call, right, to the Palestinian Arabs, right? I shared a house with an Arab family, right? I have many, many, many friends, right, in Gaza and on the West Bank. I know it intimately well, right? Number one, and number two, the life of some of these close friends is on the line. I've lost, right, several beautiful, gorgeous, dear Arab friends, right, during this time, right, who were killed doing bombardments, number one, right? And I've lost, my son, right, whose life is threatened daily, right, as he goes, and he's deeply involved in the conflict directly, right? So I worry about him coming back home at night. I actually haven't slept a lot since October 7th, because I have a very deep kind of first person relationship to many of the people on both sides. My son has lost 10 friends. I don't know if you can fathom what that means, right? But 10 friends, boys who've been killed, right? And so there's a lot to say. There's a lot to say about what's actually going on here, what the facts are, right? And I will not get drawn into, even by my dear and wondrous friend Angus, right, kind of talking about it casually, right? It's not a casual conversation, right? And so all perfect. Okay, so Angus, that was for you, my friend. Okay, so with that having said, right? With that being said, okay, let's kind of find our way. Okay, so we've made a promise on that. We will get to that. Okay. So I just wanted to hold with everybody just this kind of this sense of the unbearable privilege that we can actually be warriors. I mean, it's the word I want to use. We are warriors, right? And I don't mean that as a metaphor. This is not a metaphor. I'm asking everyone to be a warrior. I'm asking everyone, right? If you can resource more and it takes a fight, right, with your partner, have that fight in the best way you can, right? Right? Take a stand. If you can give more time, if you can give more resources, but if you can stand in any way to make this work, be a warrior, right? Be a warrior, right? And I promise you, I will meet you there. I press myself every day in exhaustion to do another hour of work and another hour and another hour because I believe that only clarifying this great library and actually both writing it, publishing it, and then delivering it into culture, which are 3 distinct and separate stages. We have to do all of them. And I think it's going to be a solid decade full on, right? So the invitation is be a warrior, right? So let's be warriors together kind of all the way. I just want to kind of just find everyone on the inside deeply. And then we're going to do like 25 minutes, just deep into kind of 15 steps, which I've been dying to do with you for a long time. So I just want to just do a little chant with everyone just for a second, and then JL is going to resonate the code. And I just want to just to feel into all of us that we're here and how delighted and how honored we all are to be together and to actually cut through the web and create a kind of digital intimacy, right? A kind of intimate intranet, right? I don't know where my friend Nicholas is. We talked about an intimate internet, and to actually feel that together and to have the staying power for that. How could anyone ever tell you that you are anything less than beautiful? How could anyone ever tell you that you are less than whole? How could anyone fail to notice that our love is just a miracle, and how deeply we are connected in our soul's unique self-symphony? How could anyone ever tell us that we are anything less than beautiful? How could anyone ever tell us that we are less than whole? How could anyone fail to notice that our love is just a miracle? And Krista, you're going to do this once for us right now also. And how deeply we are connected in our souls. How could anyone ever tell we, that we are anything less than beautiful? How could anyone ever tell us that we are less than whole? How could anyone fail to notice unique self-symphony, that our love is just a miracle? It's the miracle of we space. And how deeply we are connected in our souls. Krista, can you give it to us once? So we can get it on tune just once. Can you do that for us? Take us inside. Go.
How could anyone ever tell you? Could anyone ever tell you you are anything less than beautiful? How could anyone ever tell you you are less than whole? How could anyone fail to notice that your love is just a miracle, and how deeply we are connected in our soul?
Amen. So here we go. Let's put the code in the chat box. Give us the code, Jacqueline. Give us one reading of the code, and we dive in, and we're going to go 15 steps with Goddess's grace. This is a big, damn, crazy, crazy excited to be with you. Take us inside, Jacqueline.
Here is this week's Evolutionary Love Code. The universe is not a fact, it's a story. Not an ordinary story, a love story. Not an ordinary love story, but an evolutionary love story. And your love story is a chapter in the evolutionary love story. To know my life is a story is to know that story must be performed. There are 3 levels of relationship to performance, and particularly to the performance of our story. Level 1, pre-tragic performance. Level 2 is when we meet the tragic and we stop performing. Level 3 is the post-tragic, in which we reclaim both the dignity and the divinity of our performance. And I hand it back to you, Dr. Mark.
Thank you, JL. Thank you. That was beautiful. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Krista. So here we go. This is a big deal, and we've talked around this many times. We've done a few One Mountains on story, right? There's an essay that we're working with on what we would call the ontology of story. But I want to kind of, if we can, try and just kind of start from the beginning and at least lay out the core of why this matters. So, and I mentioned in a video that I think we sent out yesterday, but we made about a week ago, the poem by, I can never pronounce her last name, but Muriel Rukeyser, right, who dies in I think 1980, and she wrote both before World War II, during World War II, after World War II, and she was, if you will, the best of liberalism in the United States at a certain moment. And she wrote different kinds of poetry. She wrote erotic poetry. She had a sense of what we would call here in a different conversation. This is a conversation that doesn't really reach one mountain, but there's work we're doing on a phenomenology of Eros. And then there's another project called the Outrageous Love Project. And at the center of the Outrageous Love Project is something, and the project is directed by Dr. Kincaid, Dr. Christina Kincaid, who is a few feet away from me someplace in this house. And in that project, there's a particular practice which we call writing outrageous love letters. And then a subsection of that practice is writing outrageous erotic love letters. So an example of an outrageous erotic love letter in the biblical text is the Song of Solomon, which is considered in the canon of Western literature, and particularly Western mystical literature. It's considered the single most sacred text. So the single most sacred text of the Western mystical canon and the Western biblical canon is an outrageous erotic love letter, which is not erotic. It's actually almost explicitly pornographic. Pornographic, I mean pornographic, not in a negative way, in the sense that it's explicit. It's not general. It's not elusive. It describes very specifically the experience of Eros in all of its physical, most potent manifestation. And of course, it uses for its analogies, agriculture, because it's written into an agricultural society. But, his V'diglo alai ahava, his staff upon me, right, was love, right? It's yishakeni mini shakot piu, kiss me from the kisses of your mouth. And then it describes the different fragrances of the kisses. So there's descriptions of breasts and descriptions of yoni and descriptions of phallus and descriptions of how they come together. And this song is considered, right, the penultimate sacred text. So Muriel Rukeyser is, in some sense, in the Song of Solomon tradition, actually quite explicitly. She's very familiar with that text, and it directly impacted her. And, she writes a number of poems in a number of actually quite important books. But one of them, right, that appears in a collection called Speed of Darkness, right, is an erotic poem. And, the poem, one stanza in it is, lying blazing beside me, your rear beautifully and up, your thinking face, erotic body reaching in all of its colors and lights, your erotic face colored and lit, right? And she goes on. And so the poem is about Eros, right? This poem, and in this poem, right, she says famously, the universe is made up of stories, not atoms. The universe is made up of stories, not atoms. And she talks about, I'm working out the vocabulary of my silence. I'm still listening to you. The universe is not made of atoms, it's made of stories. So Muriel is saying something, and she's saying something important. Now, it's very easy to mock. And as I shared in this video that I just referred to, that we sent out, I think yesterday or a couple of weeks ago as well, a contemporary cultural critic cited Rukeyser and essentially mocked her, and mocked the need for a new story and a kind of chess move, and said, well, the universe might be made up of stories, but it's made up of atoms too. And of course, he's not wrong. The universe is made up of atoms. That's of course true. And there is a physical, concrete reality to atoms. So you might say, well, the universe is made up of atoms and stories. That's not quite true, though. The universe is made up of not atoms, but stories. And atoms are stories too. And that's where I want to start, okay? And atoms are stories too. That's a very big deal. That's a very big claim. Now, any good mystic and any good magician knows that that's true, right? If you've seen Harry Potter, how many people have seen Harry Potter? Any Harry Potter people here? It's only the single most, that in Star Wars, or the single most watched narrative structures, right, in the world. The only two major global stories, right, of the last 50 years by far. So if you've seen Harry Potter, you know something about 9.5. Anyone know 9.5? Anyone recognize 9.5? We'll just check the chat box. So 9.5 is the place that you go to Hogsworth. It's where you go for an education. And what is the first notion of education? Is atoms aren't just atoms. If you actually place your attention, you place attention closely, the placing of close attention actually reconfigures physical reality. And you're actually able to find your way through 9.5 into this magical kingdom, right? This world of Hogsworth, this other world of education. And it's not by accident that the image, right, in both Star Wars and in Harry Potter is what, my friends? Education, right? In Harry Potter, it's a school, and it's about the transmission between the generations, one that we've lost in this generation. It's one of the greatest existential risks, is the interruption of the transmission between generations. And my friend Zach Stein, right, talks about this a lot, importantly, right? He wrote a book called Education in a Time Between Worlds, right, which is the educational dimension. He's a close student, a close friend, a close partner, right? And he's really focusing on this education issue, and he's correct. And I'm focusing on it from a different perspective, the perspective of the lineage. And the lineage talks about a man in the chapter 5 of the book of Genesis, whose name is Hanoch, or Enoch, Enoch. And the Ethiopian Solomon lineage is the book of Enoch, is the primary book. It's a book of the Apocrypha in the mystical tradition of the great lineages of Solomon that shaped both Christianity, both Judaism, and in many ways, right, some of the most important strains in Islam, the book of Enoch. And the word Enoch it's a story about a human being who becomes a God-man, a human being that becomes a God-man. And that's the purpose. A human being is supposed to become a God-woman. A human being is supposed to become a God-man. That's what it means to be a human being, is to know that I'm actually participatory. I'm a unique participatory expression of the field of the divine, which is the field of value, which is the field not just of matter, but that it ultimately matters. And the word Enoch, the actual word means Chanoch. Chanoch is the Hebrew word, which means education. That's what the word means. It means education. So Harry Potter, on the one hand, is an educator. The whole story is about education. It's about teachers and students, and the relationship between teachers and students, and the relationship, between the peers who are students, and the appropriate nature of the transmission, right? And the charlatan teachers, the pseudo teachers, the demonic teachers, right? And the great teachers. And what it means to be Dumbledore, right? What does it mean to be a teacher? So that's actually what this is. Isn't that wild, my friends? That this myth that's sitting right in front of us is about education. That's what it's about. And of course, Star Wars is about a particular relationship between a teacher and a student. And the teacher is Obi-Wan. And Obi-Wan has a teacher, Qui-Gon Jinn. And Qui-Gon Jinn has a teacher who is Yoda. And Yoda has a teacher. It's unclear who Yoda's teacher is. And then Obi-Wan Kenobi has a teacher whose name is Anakin Skywalker. And it's in the relationship between Anakin, right, and Obi-Wan, and then in Yoda, who potentially can both be his teachers. And it's their inability to hold him as a student that introduces the false teacher, Palpatine, who then seduces Anakin to the dark side. So both stories, did everyone get this? It's kind of wild, right? This is all about education, the entire thing. And the teacher function is critical, knowing and understanding the teacher function. So these two stories at the very, very center of culture are about education. Now, back at the ranch, let's kind of follow our thread. So when Muriel Rukeyser writes, right, reality's made up not of atoms, but of stories, and this cultural critic, kind of mocks it and says, no, there's atoms also, right? He's not engaged in education. He's playing chess. But actually, there's something deeper that's happening. It's not about mocking an idea and scoring a point, right, in a kind of, public display of virtuosity on the internet. It's about education. Let's be educators. To be an educator is a lover. It's to be a lover. And you got to decide in life, is life a chess game or is life a love story? And of course, when you tell a person that thinks that life is a chess game, that life is a love story, he thinks you're making a chess move. Does everyone get what I just said? Right? It's like, whoa, right? It's not a chess move. It's about ripping our hearts open. It's about ripping our hearts open. And so we need to understand that, yes, the universe is made up of atoms, but atoms themselves are also stories. And how do I know atoms are stories? Well, 9.5, that's the point of 9.5. I'm going to give you 3 ways that we know that atoms are stories. But first, 9.5. And as the first educational point is that actually those firmly constructed structures of matter that you think are implacable and immovable, actually pay close attention and you can walk right through them. That's actually not wrong. It's not wrong in terms of magic. We do believe in fairies. We do. Right? That's true. Peter Pan got that right. But number 2, it's also true in terms of mysticism, the interior sciences. But number 3, it's also true in terms of the exterior sciences. If you actually understand the nature of reality, you understand that reality has 2 components. And one component is story. And atoms, right, participate in the story function of cosmos. Atoms are, and what is a story? So let's just figure out together what a story is, okay? Is everyone with me? Are we okay? Is everyone okay? I was going to check everyone's okay. We're going deep here. Okay, let's go in deep all together, okay? So what are we saying before we want to kind of demonstrate and show that not just mysticism and magic, but actually the classical sciences actually understand that reality is a story all the way down and all the way up. The notion that an atom is a thing is ridiculous in science today. And I could cite you 10 quotes right now, but I won't, from various leading edge scientists. But an atom's not a thing. And the lineage already understood this. The lineage has a word. The lineage in Hebrew has a word for a thing. It's called davar. Davar, D-A-V-A-R, davar. It's a thing. But davar also means a word. So a thing is a word. And a word is the semantics of cosmos. A word is the linguistics of cosmos. And language is not a thing. Language is a self-organizing code, as Lena said it to me in a passing text. Shouldn't use those exact words, but language is a code that writes itself out of the field of Eros of reality, and language holds interiors. That's the whole point of language. Language doesn't just communicate exteriors. Language holds interiors. It's a big deal. So a davar, a word or logos, and a thing in the original Hebrew are the same because you can't ultimately split between them. Does that make sense? So an atom is not just a thing, although an atom does have a thing of quality, but an atom is vast, spacious, open space. And an atom is a set of relationships between different parts. That's what an atom is. An atom is a set of relationships. And those relationships are animated by anybody? By allurement. Those relationships are animated by allurement. And there's a set of allurements. We begin in a few seconds after, or very nanoseconds after the Big Bang, with these sets of allurements between protons and neutrons. And protons and neutrons are actually sets of quarks with different relationships between the quarks, up quarks and down quarks. That's the difference between a proton and a neutron. It's one of the differences. But protons and neutrons come together, but then electrons, 380,000 years after the Big Bang, are uniquely introduced into the story, and the play of allurement shifts, and the proton, neutron, and electron together, all of them together, form this new whole called an atom. But they emerge, this new wholeness emerges from a story of allurement. And it's allurement towards life, towards ever deeper uniqueness, towards ever more wholeness, towards ever more creative possibility, towards ever more value, right? Towards ever more transformation and capacity for transformation. Now, all of those 6 things that I just said, uniqueness, allurement, right? Desire, allurement's desire for wholeness, wholeness itself, right? Transformation, transformative capacity, vectors of transformation, vectors of attention, right? In other words, there's a placing of attention between the proton, neutron, and electron that then generates an atom, which itself then has a new capacity to place attention. All of these are first principles and first values of cosmos, and the first principles and first values of cosmos are the plot lines of the cosmic story, right? These are the plot lines of the story. So reality is not merely a fact, reality is a story. It's like, wow. It's like, wow. Reality. So atoms are stories too. Now, let's stay close, my friends. Stay close. It's beautiful. Let's see if we can kind of get it really clearly. So one of the principles of reality is that reality is relationships. It's relationship between parts, 1. 2 is, right? Reality is, another way to say it is, reality is intimacies. Reality is a set of intimacies when parts come together to form a new wholeness or a new shared identity, right? And another way to say it is that reality is evolution, right? It's stories, right? And what's evolution? Evolution equals, reality equals evolution, and evolution is a series of transformations. And those are the plot lines of cosmos. That's not a static cosmos. Right? But it's more than just a dynamic cosmos. It's not just a randomly dynamic cosmos, although randomness is also part of the plot line in the story. There's a dimension of, right, openness in the story. I wouldn't quite use the word randomness, but there's a dimension of openness. There's randomness. I would say there is randomness. There's randomness in the context of a storyline, right? There's randomness in the context of a set of first principles and first values that are going in a particular direction, right? That have a telos, right? It's not just an erotic cosmos. It's a cosmos with telos. That's why my friend Barbara liked to talk about a telerotic universe. And that's correct. And so reality is not merely a fact. Reality is a story. Right? Reality is not an ordinary story. It's a story of allurement. It's a love story. But a love story doesn't just have allurement. A love story also has, anybody? Autonomy. It's not just I'm allured to you. I also want to be me. So love is not, we just come together. Love is the right balance, the respect that lives between 2 others. That's why intimacy is shared identity in the context of otherness, right? So love is the precise, calibrated balance between allurement and autonomy. That's what love is, right? If we think love is allurement, the relationship collapses. If we think love is autonomy, right? Love means never having to say you're sorry. That's one of the dumber lines ever written. Thank you. Movie Love Story, 1970, right? Jenny says to Oliver, dumb. Right? Of course you say you're sorry. Of course you apologize, right? What a kind of crazy thing is that? Of course you do, right? You're not just autonomy. You're autonomy in communion. You're autonomy and allurement. So love is the precise balance between autonomy and allurement. So reality is not merely a fact. Reality is a story, right? Reality is not merely a story. Reality is a love story. But that's not a mere metaphor. That is a precise metaphor. That's a scientific metaphor, if you will. right? Meaning it's reflecting facts, right? Facts, right? Fact is one of the ways that the under 30 generation, right, right, says, oh, there's actually some real stuff happening. Facts, right? Facts, right? Aubrey said to me that his friend Jake said to him recently when he was sharing with them some piece of this new story of value. Jake said, facts, right? Facts, right? But facts come together in a story. So realities, right? What we're talking about here is not mere metaphor, facts, right? Meaning this is the nature of reality, right? That this is backed by the universe, right? This is not fanciful, right? This is actually fundamental. This is fundamental. Fundamental to reality is that reality is not merely a fact. Reality is a story. Reality is not just atoms. Reality is stories, and atoms are stories too. Does everyone get that? Now, in this ancient book, Sefer Yetzirah, the book of, friends, the book of creation, this ancient text called Sefer Yetzirah, it says that reality is constituted, and we said this a couple of weeks ago, reality is constituted by sipur, right, by story, and by mispire, by number. Now, atoms also have valence, and valence has to do with the number, right, of electrons, right? Its relationship, right? It's the, right, you know, an atomic number has to do with the number of protons and their set of relationships. So there's a number dimension to reality, right? Reality is also numbers, but numbers are also stories, right? Numbers are also stories, and Talia's brought that, you know, focused on that very, very important idea. Numbers are also stories, right? Numbers going someplace, 1, 2, 3, 4, it's going somewhere, right? When we say Ramanujan is intimate with every integer in the universe, it's not a mechanical intimacy. A number is telling a story. Mathematical values are part of the story of cosmos. So story itself has the same root word as number. The reason story and number share the same root word in the original Hebrew is because they're actually different faces of the one. Reality is number and story, and number is also a story. And it's an incomplete story. It's an ever-evolving story. And that's why Gödel's incompleteness theorem says you can't have complete mathematical sets. And the mathematicians who tried to create complete mathematical sets, right, as Daniel has pointed out, and my dear friend Daniel, we were talking about this late one night, you know, went insane, right? Because reality is a constantly evolving story. One of the qualities of eternity is evolution. And the story is a story that holds paradox, because any great story, right, is its capacity to hold paradox. And in fact, the beauty of a story, if you read the Kabbalistic Tree of Life, or if you read Alfred North Whitehead's Process and Reality, they're both saying something very similar, that the beauty of the story is its capacity to hold opposites, to have as many opposites as possible in the sets of relationships in a way that those opposites generate a larger whole. So, wow. So reality is a story. Reality is not really a fact. Reality is a story. So one, in a story, there's not just, as David Hume would say, constant conjunction, not just adjacent facts, right? But there's adjacent possibles. Right? There's adjacent possibles, meaning, and the word adjacent possible is a terminus technis, but I'm using it to mean there's causal connection. And it's one thing or one word, because there's no split between a thing and a word, right? Actually leads to the other. The resonance of one note of music, right, inexorably leads to the next possibility of music. And there's great openness, there's great possibility, but that possibility is within a context, within a field of value, right? Which is why this reality produces, right, a world in which we reflect on the nature of the world, and we reflect on the meaning of the world, in which we reflect on the invitation of our own being, right? And as we move up the evolutionary chain, the depth of that reflection becomes more urgent and more pressing. And that reflection evolves and it deepens. And we keep coming from different lenses and different doors, right, to this understanding that somehow Eros is central to the whole story, right? But that's not an accident. That's because it's an erotic story, because it's a love story, because actually Eros is backed by the universe. So the first notion, the first dimension of story is that there's a causal connection. Things are intimately and integrally and inexorably related, number one. Number two, there's a level of interiors in story. And a story means it's not just atoms, it's not just thing, but just like atoms are not just things are not just things. Things are stories, atoms are stories. There's a story dimension. Things are not just numbers, it's not just 1, 2, right? It's not just mathematics. Mathematics is inexorably inseparable from the quality of story. So there's a level of interior in the story. And three, and these are in some sense saying the same thing, I'm just saying in a different way, right? That interior involves desire, right? There's desire in the story. Desire is an essential part of the story. Number four, there's need in the story. The story is animated by need, right? Evolution is love in action in response to desire. And evolution is love in action in response to need. Okay, so there's a need in the story. That's number four. Number five, right? The story has telos, it has direction. That's what desire means, but I want to say it in a different way. The story has telos, the story is reaching for something, right? There's a plot line to the story. That's number five. Number six, the plot line to the story is value. The story is reaching for value. Reality has an appetite for value. We always cite Whitehead for that, but its original source, right, is in the interior sciences. And there's in a book that I was actually very, very privileged to write. I couldn't write it today. I don't even know how I did it then, but I look at it now, there's no way I could do it, but it's called Radical Kabbalah. And I think it's, I don't know, chapter 14 of volume 1, there's a chapter on desire. That's the quality of cosmos, right? So desire, that's number 6. There's this quality of desire, and the desire of cosmos is for value. That's number 6, for value. Cosmos reaches for value and for ever greater value, right? And number 7, there's a degree of freedom in the story, right? So the story is not a mechanical manual. There's some degree of first person in the story. According to Stuart Kauffman, there's, who's a mathematical complexity theorist, there's free will all the way down to the world of matter. According to Richard Feynman, the physicist, there's some dimension of aliveness, some dimension of proto-choice all the way down. But however we tell that story, right, freedom is a key dimension to the story. Right, that's number 7, I think, right? Right, number 8, right, last 2. Right, number 8 is the story itself evolves. It's part of the story is that the story evolves, right? Part of the story is that the story evolves, right? There's an evolution of the story, right? Right, and I'm just going to take a little break. And Angus, you're going to get in trouble today, my friend. So I'm going to take a little break for Angus one more time, just because we're loving on Angus today. But I'm not going to take a big diversion. But Angus is justice. He writes in justice, and justice appears as justice on the human level. But you're correct that justice is a first principle and first value. This is a much deeper dive than we can do now. But often a first principle and first value, Angus, appears under a different name earlier. So justice appears in the world of matter as harmony. Does that make sense, brother? And I shared this with Howard Bloom. He was very excited about it, right? Because in other words, justice as we know, it's very beautiful, right? It's harmony. Then harmony evolves, right, through the animal world and ultimately appears as justice and fairness. So that's beautiful. That's end bracket. Okay, so, but back to story. So there's freedom in a story, right? And then finally, right, number, I think 9 we're at, is that a story often involves crisis. There's often crisis, which generates the next dimension of the story. Whether it's the oxygen crisis that appears, in the single-celled / prokaryote, which are not exactly the same. Single-celled and prokaryote's not exactly the same. There's a jump to multicellular and eukaryote, which again is not exactly the same. But I'm not getting into the details of that story, but that basic move from single cell to multicellular, from prokaryote to eukaryote, although again, they're not exactly isomorphic. That movement comes from a crisis, the oxygen crisis. The oxygen was destroying single-celled organisms. And so there was a crisis that generated a momentous leap in the nature of relationship and the nature of intimacy, right? And we generated multicellular life that actually enabled oxygen to be generative of life, and the relationship between oxygen and carbon changed. But that notion of crisis being an evolutionary driver, right? That happens all the way up. There's always a crisis. That's part of the plot line of the story. The crisis is always a crisis of relationship or a crisis of intimacy. And the crisis of intimacy generates a new dimension of the plot line, which is the evolution of intimacy and the evolution of relationship as a core part of the storyline, right? And so that's crisis, right? And I guess number 10, right, is the evolution of story itself. That part of the story is that the story evolves, And the story evolves, Angus, across all the first principles and first values. So there's a set of first principles and first values, which is what that the story desires. The story is reaching for the first principles and first values. So let's say uniqueness, but the experience of uniqueness, let's say in a particular element of the cosmos, let's say potassium, right? Or let's go even more basic, helium and hydrogen. Let's go farther down, right? So there's a unique element, and that experience of uniqueness is whatever helium's experience is what it is. But actually, Ted's experience, who just wrote something in the chat box, has a more, right, to the best of our understanding, has a more conscious experience of his uniqueness. So my experience of my uniqueness unfolds. So there's both continuity, there's uniqueness as a value all the way down and all the way up, but then there's an evolution of uniqueness. And that's true of all the plot lines of cosmos, they evolve. But even deeper, there's an evolution of our relationship to story itself. We become aware that the story of cosmos is living through us. Does that make sense, everyone? In other words, the story is not unconscious. We become aware that we are the universe, a love story in person. It's not that there's a universal love story over there. I become aware that I am that story. I am the universal love story in person. Okay. So this is, I would say, I would like to go for another 15 minutes, but I'm not going to, because we didn't make that request. So what we'll do is we'll do part 2 next week on story. Well, we got to do part 1. Okay. Right. But in other words, I want to get just that last point. Okay. I want to get just that last point, which is, right, the evolution of story means we actually begin to become aware that we are enfleshed by cosmos as a story waiting to be told. Does everyone get that sense? We are enfleshed. That's a word that KK likes to use. We are enfleshed by cosmos, right, as a story waiting to be told. Right? And that realization, right, is core, meaning reality is not merely a fact, reality is a story. And we say reality is not an ordinary story, reality is a love story, right? And then we say reality is not an ordinary love story, reality is an evolutionary love story, meaning all of evolution is a story. But it's even before evolution, right? The inception of reality is part of the divine story. And the very fact, I just want to get clear with me, friends. Get clear with me. How do I know there's a divine story? Am I just making that up? Is that just a dogma? No, that's exactly what, Wittgenstein. I was reading Wittgenstein on Friday morning, and I was reading John Leslie, who's a Canadian writer, philosopher. He's actually quite a good philosopher. And, Wittgenstein says, in the end, when I step into eternity, which for Wittgenstein means to be beneath time and space, and not everlasting time, beneath time and space, he says, I cannot help but be dazzled at how extraordinary it is, meaning it's not ordinary in any logical way, that there's anything here at all, right? Which is what Fichte and Schelling are talking about when they say, why is there something rather than nothing? But it's not just their question, it's the question, right? That every great human being has to ask, why is there something rather than nothing? And there's only one realization, there's only one way to respond to that, which is infinity is not an unmoving eternity. It's not an unchanging eternity, right? Infinity desired intimacy, or infinity desired and desires finitude. Now, doesn't that sound remarkably like a story? In other words, a story has desire, right? A story has a plot line, a story has freedom, a story desires more value, right? A story has both interiors and exteriors. There's causal connection between the events in a story. In other words, the inception of reality itself is part of the divine story. And it's God Goddess herself is not merely a thing. She's the logos, the word. She's a story. God not only loves stories, God is a story, right? And that's why the tree of life, Lena, is Esser Sfirot. And 10 Sfirot are translated usually as 10 luminations, but 10 luminations, right? The description and the lineage for the great tree of life and the great Western lineage tradition of interior sciences, right? 10 Sfirot, 10 luminations is really 10 stories. A Sphira is a story at its core. So divinity discloses herself as story. And he incarnates the same first principles and first values that are the story of reality, right? So, wow. And so infinity desires finitude. Infinity desires finitude because finitude is intrinsic and ultimate value. Because the nature of the story is the desire for more value. That's one of the qualities of story. And ultimate value is divinity. There's no split between them. So infinity desires more value, which is finitude. Finitude is you and me. You and me, we are unique discretions of finitude. That's what we are. Right? We are unique numbers and unique stories. We're unique numbers and we're unique things and we're unique stories, numbers telling a story. We're going someplace, right? Our days are not only numbered, right, in the sense of mortality, our days are intrinsically unique numbers, right, in the great mathematical calculus of divinity, unfolding mad love in an erotic cosmos, right? So doing the math of our life makes sense. We got to do it right. We got to make our calculations, but not in a calculating way. It's not a game theoretic, right? Rivalrous conflict governed by win-lose metrics. There's only one question I ever ask myself. Am I in full integrity? If I'm in full integrity, I'm in my story and I'm in delight and I'm in joy and I'm in pleasure, no matter what's happening. My story matters. So that's the end of the realization, right? Not just reality is not merely a fact, reality is a story. Reality is not an ordinary story, reality is a love story. Reality is not an ordinary love story, reality is an evolutionary love story. And then the last piece, and your story, my story, are literally chapter and verse in the universal love story. Literally, right? Not metaphorically. The way they say it in the lineage texts of the 19th century, they say mamish. Mamish is a great word, M-A-M-A-S-H, mamish, mamash. In Hebrew, mamash means ontologically, literally. I literally am chelek Eloha mimal mamash. I am chelek, I'm a part, I participate in Eloha, in the field of value, which is the field of divine, right? That is everything, mamash, literally, ontologically. It's the ontology, right, of story. My story really is a chapter in God's story. And God gets unbearably depressed when we rip out pages in God's book of life. I am a page in the divine book of life. That literally is the only accurate self-conception that is possible for a human being. And that's what we call homo amor. That's the move from homo sapien to homo amor. It's the realization that my atoms are stories as well. And there's no split at all, ultimately, between interiors and exteriors, right? It's all a love story, for real. Cha, right? And that's why we look at each other and we say, right, how could anyone ever tell us? How could anyone ever tell you? How could anyone ever tell me that that you are anything less than beautiful, right? It's not just a song. How could anyone ever tell you that you are less than whole? But you're not just autonomy. You're not whole by yourself. How could anyone ever tell you that our love is anything less than a wild miracle of we, the creation of an irreducibly unique intimacy that never was, is, or will be ever again? Cha.